On November 20th of 2018, the defendant, right over here, murdered a family of 4 in their own home. His younger brother, Keith, Keith's wife, Jennifer, and Keith and Jennifer's 2 children. The defendant's 11-year-old nephew, Jesse, and his 8-year-old niece, Sophia. He waited until dark, until the early morning hours after midnight, and he came prepared. He armed himself with a loaded handgun. He wore black nitrile gloves on his hands, and he snuck up on the family while they slept. He drove his car, it was a white Porsche Macan, to their home in Colts Neck, 15 Willowbrook Road. When he arrived, he turned off the generator to their home, and then he cut the power to the house from the outside by removing the electrical meter. And then he waited in the dark, waited in the shadows, waited for his brother Keith to come outside. Sure enough, when Keith came out to check the generator, the defendant gunned him down. The defendant pointed that loaded handgun at his brother, and he pulled the trigger 6 times. 5 of those shots hit Keith. He got him in the lower back and multiple times in the head. Once Keith was out of the way, executed on the spot, no longer able to protect his family, the defendant then went inside his brother's house, a home he'd been in countless times before, a home, you'll learn, he knew like the back of his hand, a home where Keith's wife and children were. And in there, in the chaos and confusion of having been awoken from sleep, in the shock and terror of having their home invaded, and in the dark, the defendant hunted them down. He stabbed his sister-in-law, Jennifer, multiple times in her back, her chest, and her abdomen, and he shot her in the head. He stabbed his nephew, Jesse, multiple times in his upper body and threw his arm into his chest. And he stabbed his niece, Sophia, 17 times over her entire 45-pound body, including deep stab wounds in her face and the top of her head. And when he was all finished, he went into the basement, inside of the cedar closet, where he started a fire. It was a slow-burning fire that smoked and smoldered for hours before anyone was alerted to it. He cut the Verizon fiber optic line in the basement that fed into the optical network terminal, and then he left. He drove back to his own home at 27 Tilton Drive in Ocean Township, about 20 minutes away, where his own wife and 2 adult daughters were sleeping. He took the gun he used, and he swapped out the barrel. So one of the things you're going to learn during the course of this trial is that bullets travel through the barrel of a gun, and ballistically, the bullets can be matched up to the barrel, while the shell casings can be matched up to the gun itself. What the evidence will show is that the defendant removed the barrel from the gun he used, and he replaced it with a different barrel. And then he put the gun away inside of a metal locker in his basement. He took off his clothing, including his blood-stained jeans and his bloodied black nitrile gloves. He put them all in a pile in his basement underneath a window well. And then he went outside around back to that basement window well, just above where that pile was. And he started a fire there too. Except this time the defendant got his own family out, safe and sound. Now, Jesse and Sophia, on the other hand, were not safe or sound. What you're going to learn is that while their parents, Keith and Jennifer, were both deceased at the time the defendant set fire to their home, both having sustained fatal gunshot wounds to the head, those children were still alive. The medical examiners are going to tell you that the children's autopsies revealed that in addition to being stabbed repeatedly, They also exhibited signs of smoke inhalation. And so the evidence will show that Jesse and Sophia were still alive and breathing after their uncle repeatedly stabbed them. Still alive and breathing after their uncle set fire to their home and left them. Still alive and breathing as the smoke began to rise from the basement. And that, you will learn, is how those two children spent the final moments of their lives. Bleeding to death and inhaling smoke. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the defendant, Paul Caniero. So one of the things you're going to learn during the course of this trial about Uncle Paul is what motivated him. What motivated him on November 20th of 2018 to do what he did. And that, the evidence will show, came down to none other than greed and desperation. We're going to talk more about the motive evidence shortly. But before we do that, it's important to understand how the investigation of this case began and some of the other evidence that it revealed. So let's pick up where we left off. You're going to learn that the defendant arrived back home to 27 Tilton Drive in Ocean Township in his white Porsche Macan at 4:08 a.m. A little less than an hour later, at 5:02 a.m., the Ocean Township Police Department received an alert for a basement fire alarm activation at the defendant's residence. The first couple of patrolmen were on scene within a few minutes. The defendant, his wife Susan, and their two daughters, Caitlin and Marissa, were seated in a car. It was Susan's car. It was a Porsche Cayenne, and it was parked across the street from their house. Now, you're going to get to see photos of 27 Tilton Drive, but just to give you a visual, it was a two-story house with a full basement and an attached garage. So if you're facing the house, the garage would be all the way to the left, and there was a driveway that wrapped around and went right up to those garage doors. Now, parked in the driveway that morning were multiple cars, including the defendant's white Porsche Macan. It was actually a loaner car, and it was parked facing that last garage door, closest to the left. Now, the fire was on the complete opposite side of the house. So again, if you're facing the house, the fire would be all the way to the right and around back, in that back right corner, right in that basement window well. The fire ended up traveling all the way into the attic and spreading. And to make matters worse, the fire had been set right near the natural gas meter. So when the first couple of patrolmen arrived on scene and saw this, they quickly began evacuating the neighboring houses. Now, you're going to learn about two other areas of fire at the defendant's house that morning. The second area of fire was back over by the garage. When the first couple of patrolmen arrived on scene, they saw and they quickly extinguished this tiny little fire right at the bottom corner of the garage door. And then the third area of fire that morning was actually the Porsche Macan itself. It had burn marks all over it. Now, in addition, you're going to learn about some items of evidence that were collected from the driveway and garage area that morning. You're going to hear that there was a red gasoline can with a melted nozzle lying near the garage door by the Porsche Macan, that there was a charred, dark-colored glove located in the driveway, and in the back seat of the defendant's Porsche Macan, officers located a little piece of what appeared to be a black nitrile glove. In addition, you're going to learn that a DVR recording system was collected from the defendant's garage that morning. Now, everyone was on scene for several hours that morning, including the defendant and his family, and during that time, officers and fire investigators were making efforts to determine how the fires might have started. Remember, they knew nothing about what had occurred earlier in Colts Neck at that point. They spoke to several individuals on scene, including the defendant, and you'll get to hear about the full extent of the conversations they had with him. But basically what he told them was that he was awoken to the fire alarms going off, that he saw smoke coming through the vents, that he collected his family, and that they all exited the house. He tells them that he later went back inside of the house, into the garage, and backed out Susan's car. It was the Porsche Cayenne that they were all sitting in. He also tells officers that he hurt his hand somehow, that he banged it on something on the way outside of the house. And officers observed, and you'll get to see pictures of the back of the defendant's left hand. There appeared to be some sort of an injury to it. Now, time goes by. It gets to be about 11:45 a.m. and detectives ask the defendant and his family if they would come to the Ocean Township Police Department to speak further, and they agreed. They drive in Susan's Porsche Cayenne, again, the car that the defendant had backed out of the driveway. They take that car and they drive to the Ocean Township Police Department, and they arrive there at about noon. Shortly thereafter, while the defendant and his family are seated in the lobby of the Ocean Township Police Department, detectives receive notification of another structure fire in Monmouth County, 15 Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck. And not only that, but they learn that there's a deceased body on the lawn, and that the homeowner's name is Keith Caneiro. Pretty soon they learn that Keith and the defendant are brothers. So let's pause there for a moment now, because we have two crime scenes. We just discussed 27 Tilton Drive in Ocean Township. So let's move over now to 15 Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck. The police were first alerted to 15 Willowbrook Road by a 12:33 p.m. 911 call from a neighbor who reported seeing smoke coming from the residence and a deceased body on the lawn. The first couple of patrolmen were on scene within a few minutes. Keith Caneiro's body was lying face down in the grass. The hood of his sweatshirt had been pulled up over his head, and there was blood pooled and congealed near his head. Signs of rigor mortis had set in, and Keith's cell phone was lying in the grass near his body. The first couple of officers on scene attempted to make entry into the house, but there was too much smoke. Shortly thereafter, when firefighters arrived, they made entry. Visibility was basically zero, but what they located inside of the home were the deceased bodies of 3 more individuals. It was the rest of Keith's family. His wife Jennifer's body was located on the landing of a set of stairs in the foyer that led down to the basement. Her body was burned beyond any recognition. Their daughter Sophia's body was located on the landing of an adjacent set of stairs that led up to the second floor bedrooms, essentially right above her mom. And their son Jesse's body was located in the kitchen not too far away. Now you're going to get to also see photos of 15 Willowbrook Road, both the inside and outside of the house. But just to give you a general description, it was a large house. It sat at the end of a long driveway about 250 feet off of the road. It had 2 stories, a full basement, and an attached 3-car garage. Now there was this area near the house. If you're facing the house, it would be all the way on the right side of the house, and it was surrounded by shrubs. Behind those shrubs was where the whole house generator was located. It was large, as well as the electrical meter. What investigators found when they arrived on scene was that the generator had been switched to the off position and that the electrical meter had been physically removed and was lying on the ground. Keith Caneiro's body was not too far away in that same area, as were multiple bullets and shell casings. Now, inside of the house, in the basement, there was a cedar closet, and inside of that cedar closet was determined to be the area of origin of fire. Also in the basement is where that severed Verizon fiber optic line was located. It had been physically cut. Additionally, there were some other items of evidence collected from the house, some items of ballistic evidence, as well as a kitchen knife from the butcher's block that was located in the foyer where Jennifer's body was. Now, based upon this evidence, as well as other evidence that you're going to learn about, including video surveillance footage that was pulled from certain areas near the defendant's house, you're going to hear about certain times during the course of this trial that are going to become highly relevant. Mr. Decker is going to talk to you a lot about that timeline in his closing argument. But essentially what you're going to see is a timeline start to form. I'm going to talk to you about just some of those relevant times now. But before I do that, let me first say this about the video surveillance footage. You're going to have the opportunity to watch it. And what is depicted on there is for you and you alone to decide. Not the officers who testify about it, not anyone else. However, what the state submits that you will be able to glean from that video surveillance footage in conjunction with the surrounding testimony and all of the other evidence is the following. The state submits that you will see at 2:06 a.m. the defendant's white Porsche Macan leave the area of his driveway and drive off. You are going to learn that the drive time between the defendant's residence and 15 Willowbrook Road is approximately 20 minutes. You are going to hear that at 2:52 a.m., power was lost to 15 Willowbrook Road. You're going to learn that between 3:14 and 3:18 a.m., a series of 4 text messages were sent from Keith Canero's cell phone to his brother's cell phone, advising that his power was out, that he'd gone into the basement. The last text message being sent at 3:18 a.m. stating, "Going outside to check the generator." You're going to learn that at about 3:30 a.m., a 911 call was placed from a resident in Colts Neck who reported having heard, a few minutes prior, 6 gunshots. You're going to learn that at 3:42 a.m., the FiOS optical network terminal in Keith's basement went out of service. The state submits you will see at 4:08 a.m., the defendant's white Porsche Macan return to the area of his residence and his driveway. And of course, that brings us to 5:02 a.m., when the Ocean Township Police Department received that alert for the basement fire alarm activation. Now, in addition to this evidence, you're going to learn that multiple items were collected from both crime scenes. I'm going to talk to you about some of that relevant evidence now. You remember Susan's Porsche Cayenne, the car that the defendant backed out of the driveway and that the family sat in and ultimately drove to headquarters. Well, at headquarters, that vehicle was searched. And in the back of that vehicle, in the rear cargo area, officers located a backpack. And inside of that backpack were numerous items belonging to the defendant. His bank cards, his credit cards, his laptop, pieces of his mail, his daughter's savings bonds, his passport, and also the barrel of a 9mm handgun and a gun silencer. Now, in the defendant's basement, there was a metal locker, and located in that metal locker was a gun. It was a 9mm Sig Sauer. That gun, as well as the barrel and the silencer, were sent out to the New Jersey State Police Ballistics Unit for testing. In addition, the ballistic evidence located at 15 Willowbrook Road, so the bullets and the shell casings, those were also sent to the New Jersey State Police Ballistics Unit for testing and comparison. And you're going to hear about the conclusions of that testing. And what you're going to learn is that those conclusions included a finding that bullets and shell casings from 15 Willowbrook Road came from that barrel in his backpack and from the gun in his basement. But the gun wasn't the only thing found in the defendant's basement. There was this pile of charred items and articles all congealed together that was located right beneath the window well where the fire was started in the defendant's basement. In that pile was a pair of men's jeans with blood staining in multiple areas. Folded up in those jeans were 6 black nitrile gloves and 1 live round of ammunition, same type of ammunition and head stamp that was found at 15 Willowbrook Road. Those jeans and those gloves, as well as numerous other items, were sent out for DNA testing. You are going to have the opportunity to hear from the forensic DNA scientists who performed that testing. And they are going to tell you about their conclusions and findings for each and every piece of evidence that they tested. And what you're going to learn is that those findings, those results, included a finding that these sources of DNA located on multiple areas of those bloody jeans in the defendant's basement came from none other than his niece, Sophia Caneiro, and in one area from his nephew, Jesse Caneiro. You're also going to learn that Sophia Caneiro's DNA was on some of those black nitrile gloves as well as other items in that pile. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to this evidence, there was another kind of evidence that was revealed during the course of the investigation, and we touched on it very briefly. And that is evidence of motive. What you're going to learn is that the defendant's financial circumstances in the months and the weeks leading up to November 20th, as well as certain events that occurred just hours prior to the murders, are what motivated him. And while the state is certainly not suggesting that somehow these murders were logical or even remotely rational, when does murder ever make sense? The state is presenting these circumstances to you for you to consider as to the defendant's motive, for how he chose to deal with events and circumstances that all came to a head the night before, on November 19th. So one of the things you're going to learn about Keith Caneiro and the defendant is that in addition to their familial relationship, they also had a financial relationship. And it was this, the entanglement of their finances, that was the cause of some discord between the brothers and really the crux of the defendant's motive. You see, Keith and the defendant were business partners, and they had been for a long time. They owned 2 businesses together. Square One was a computer consulting company. And it was essentially the more profitable of the 2 businesses, the moneymaker. Keith owned 90% of Square One, and the defendant owned 10%. The second business they owned together was called EcoStar. It was a pest control company, and they owned it 50-50. Now, what you're going to learn is that in the time leading up to the murders, the defendant's financial situation was, for lack of a better term, delicate. It was essentially a house of cards. What you're going to see is that while he made a lot of money, he also spent a lot of money. He had a lot of fixed expenses, a lot of debt, and he was having a hard time just keeping up. What you're going to learn is that the defendant had 3 main or steady streams of income that he would receive in 2017 and 2018. His first stream of revenue came from income that he and his family would receive through payroll from the businesses. Now, he and his family also received their auto reimbursement through the businesses, as well as their health insurance. His second stream of revenue came from insurance disability payments that he would collect. And you're going to learn he collected from a couple of different policies. And the defendant's third source of revenue came from money that he would periodically take from the Keith Caneiro Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust bank account. We're going to talk more about that momentarily, but what's important to know for now is that these were the defendant's 3 main or steady streams of income for those years, and perhaps most importantly, income that he relied on. And what you're going to see is that even with his income, he still had a hard time keeping up with his bills, his expenses, his lifestyle. The first point of contention came down to the businesses, more precisely to the future of the businesses. You see, Square One, the more profitable business that Keith owned 90% of, that had only one major client left. And that it received about 90% of its revenue from that client. That client's contract was set to expire and would likely not renew. Now, Keith had planned for this. He had foreseen this coming for some time, and Keith had a plan for his and his family's future financial well-being. And he communicated this plan to the defendant. Keith's plan involved, if Square One were to dissolve, his plan involved selling EcoStar, the business that they owned 50-50, and using his half of the proceeds from that sale, along with potentially borrowing money from his life insurance trust and or 401k to pay down his mortgage. He wanted to get a job in the marketplace and be done with the defendant, at least in terms of their financial relationship. Now, the thing about Keith's plan is that had it come to fruition, it would have had some negative consequences on the defendant's already delicate financial situation. For starters, he would lose his first steady stream of income, that being payroll that he and his family received through the businesses, not to mention their health insurance and their auto reimbursement. But secondly, you're going to learn that unlike Keith, the defendant would not have as easily been able to replace that income simply by getting a job in the marketplace because of his disability payments. Now, the second point of contention, and what really compounded the situation, came down to the defendant's third source of revenue, the Keith Caneiro Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust. During the course of this trial, you're going to get to hear testimony about what an irrevocable trust is, why someone would have one, and the exact terms of this particular trust. But basically, Keith had set this trust up back in 1999, prior to him and Jennifer getting married. Now, per the terms of the trust, it was essentially an estate planning tool, by the way. Per the terms of that trust, whatever money would be in there at the time of Keith's death was to be used for his wife. Now, if both of them were deceased, then per the terms of the trust, whatever money was in there would be used for the benefit of their children. And if all of them should become deceased, then half of that money was to go to the defendant and half was to go to their third brother named Corey. Now, after Keith created this trust, he purchased what's called a whole life insurance policy from Canada Life Insurance Company. The face value or the death benefit payout for that policy was for $3 million. He then transferred ownership of that policy over to the trust, so that now the trust became the beneficiary. The idea being that upon Keith's death, that money would go into the trust and then be distributed according to the terms of the trust. Now, one of the things you're going to learn about an irrevocable trust is that once the settlor creates it, so here the settlor would be Keith, once they create it, they give up a great deal of control and discretion over that trust, and instead, they appoint a trustee. In this case, Keith appointed none other than his trusted older brother, the defendant, as his trustee. As trustee, you're going to learn that the defendant was afforded a great deal of control and discretion over this trust. There's no doubt. You're going to hear that testimony. But what you're also going to hear is that that discretion did not afford the trustee to steal and deceive and act in bad faith. Now, like with any life insurance policy, there were premium payments that were due periodically to keep the policy active. In this case, those premium payments were due quarterly. And the way it worked was that a bank account had been set up at TD Bank called the Keith Caneiro Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust. But basically, it was just a checking account. And the way it was funded was through direct deposits from Keith's payroll. Now, the defendant's job as the trustee, or at least the job that he took on, was to make those premium payments from that bank account. So essentially, whenever those premiums were due, the defendant would go in to the online banking account, and you're going to learn that the defendant did most of his banking online. He would go into that account and make those premium payments over to the insurance company. Now, in about January of 2017, the evidence will show that the defendant began taking money from that trust bank account, that TD Bank account, sometimes to the detriment of paying the premiums. Sometimes you'll see he paid the premiums, sometimes he didn't. Now, in April of 2018, Keith called him out on it. When confronted, the defendant told Keith that he accidentally transferred money to the wrong payee, that he went and paid a school loan. $25,054 to be precise, that he accidentally transferred that money. He apologized, he said he would make restitution, and he said that he had his, quote, head up his ass, his words. But what the evidence will show is that not only did the defendant not make restitution, but he never paid a single payment to Canada Life again after April of 2018, not one. But what he did do was he continued to help himself to that money in that checking account. And this time was different, because this time he began covering his tracks. You see, the defendant began altering the bank statements. One of the things you're going to learn is that the defendant was the only person who had access to this TD checking account, not even Keith Caneiro. And what would happen is he would receive the bank statements, and then he would periodically send them over to their accountant, a man named Steve Weinstein, who you'll hear from. The defendant began altering the statements in May of 2018. And what he would do is, anytime he made a withdrawal from that TD checking account, he would change the name of the payee on the bank statements to say, Canada Life. But in reality, it was going to himself. And you'll get to see the actual bank statements next to the altered bank statements. And this went on for some time. May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So now we come to November 19th of 2018. Unfortunately, it was on that day that Keith and his insurance adjuster, a man named Ronald Artigas, who you'll hear from, it was on that day that they made inquiry with Canada Life to determine the status of Keith's life insurance policy. Well, it was then that they learned that no monies had been paid to Canada Life since April. They spent a good part of the day trying to figure it out. And they just couldn't understand it. They just couldn't figure it out because they're looking at the bank statements that they received from the defendant. And the bank statements showed money going to Canada Life. But Canada Life was saying they hadn't received any money. It was that afternoon into the evening that Keith Caneiro made two relatively short but tragically fateful phone calls to his brother, the defendant. Now, you are going to have the unique opportunity to see and hear these two phone calls. And that is simply because Keith and Jennifer had security cameras inside of their home with audio and visual capabilities. Now, let me be clear. You are not going to see these murders occur. The cameras stopped working at 2:52 a.m. when the defendant cut power to the house. But what you are going to see is these two phone calls. You're going to see Keith Caneiro in his final hours. You're going to hear what he is saying to the defendant, what he is yelling to the defendant only hours before he and his family were murdered. The first phone call took place at 3:50 p.m. Keith called the defendant, and he tells him, Canada Life is saying they haven't been receiving any money. He tells him, I need to access the money. And he asks the defendant if he could send him the online password for that TD checking account so that he can go in and do the research himself. The second phone call takes place at about 6:05 p.m. Keith calls the defendant back. And this time, Keith now demands the password for that online checking account. And he's yelling at his brother, I need the fucking login, Paul. Paul, I need you to wake the fuck up. I need to see where the money went. He tells the defendant that he has a couple of hours to get back to him, like 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock came and went. The defendant never did get back to Keith with that password. Instead, he began making plans. Plans that were executed about 8 hours later when he snuck out of the house in the middle of the night in his white Porsche Macan. And you know how those plans ended. Greed and desperation. On November 19th of 2018, the defendant's house of cards was about to come crumbling down. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're listening to some of the motive evidence in this case and the financial testimony, please keep in mind, the state is not presenting this evidence to you to bombard you with numbers or counting, but the state is presenting this evidence to you so that you have an understanding of the context and the backdrop in which these murders occurred. And I submit to you, what the evidence is going to show is that it wasn't so much about what the defendant stood to gain from Keith and his family's deaths as it was what he stood to lose. What he stood to lose had they lived. This was my opportunity to tell you a little bit about this case and about what you're going to hear. But it's also my opportunity to tell you about what you're not going to hear and what this case is not about. And what this case is not is some made-for-TV movie with plot twists and shocking revelations and surprise endings. Make absolutely no mistake, this is a case about the evidence and where that evidence led and who that evidence led to. As the state, Mr. Decker and I have the burden of proving to you each and every charge beyond a reasonable doubt. We also have the burden of proving to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was the individual who committed these offenses. And that is a burden we welcome. At the end of this case, I submit to you that the evidence will leave you firmly convinced that one person and one person only committed these crimes. One person who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And that person is sitting right here today. And at the end of this case, I submit to you that the only verdict that that evidence will support is a verdict of guilty on each and every count. Thank you.